Hey everyone, it's Star Wars week, and I am super excited to read a few short stories with you all. Today, we're starting with a book called Star Wars: Forces of Destiny, The Rey Chronicles. So we're going to go through short stories all about Rey from the new Star Wars movies. Let's get started. This is written by Emma Carlson Burnett. Tracker Trouble is our first story. Rey twirled the worn co-pilot seat and sat down at the controls of the Millennium Falcon. Han settled into the captain's seat and shot her an uneasy glance. Rey looked over at him as he patted the Falcon's scarred control panel. The stars streaked by outside, blurred by the hyperspeed.
Okay, Han flicked a few switches. Now, once we get to Maz's castle, keep your head down and leave it to me.
Rey smiled and patted the arm of the co-pilot seat. She looked around the cockpit. This must be what it felt like to be part of a crew, like she'd always wanted. And she was off Jakku, away from the sand and the heat and the need for constant vigilance and Unkar. Rey felt something loosen inside her, something that had been knotted so tight all those years she had hardly felt it anymore. All her life she'd been waiting to leave Jakku. Now she had left Jakku, and she'd flown for real this time, and she'd fought the First Order for the first time. As she thought back on the day, Rey felt dizzy with her life's sudden acceleration. The First Order had called in an airstrike soon after Rey met Finn at Nema Outpost on Jakku. The two TIE fighters had zoomed down on them, firing and hitting the sand, spraying it everywhere. She, Finn, and BB-8 sprinted toward a quad jumper as the TIE's laser blast screamed on the ground all around them. Then a blast hit the quad jumper, which exploded into a ball of flames. She shouted at Finn and BB-8 to run for a wreck nearby. She was familiar with the ship, but for as long as she could remember, it had sat motionless in the sand, baking in the white-hot sun. The sweat poured down her face and neck as she flipped the switches from the pilot seat, firing up the engines, while Finn got ready to operate the gun from below. The ship roared to life, bumping and dragging all along the sand, then soared with a heart-lifting force into the blue sky. They shot through the ruins of rusted space hulks that lay in the desert, Rey hanging onto the controls as the Falcon shuddered and creaked. In the gun turret, Finn tried to return fire as BB-8 rolled around behind Rey like a loose grav ball until he stabilized himself with magnetic cables. Then they were hit, heading straight for a collision with a massive piece of junk. Gritting her teeth, Rey grabbed at the thruster and fired it, twisting the yoke at the same time to turn them sharply and soar straight toward the heavens. She was flying after all those years of practicing on dead ships, and nothing ever felt more natural. Finn managed to take out one of the TIEs, but then the Falcon's gun sustained a hit. Finn couldn't aim the gun anymore. He shouted at Rey that they'd have to shake off the other TIE. It was time for some desperate flying. Up ahead were all the dead, hollowed-out thrust rings of a giant superstar destroyer. Her heart pounding in her ears, hands wet with sweat, Rey flew the Falcon directly into one of the thrusters like a fly into the mouth of a herbivore. The TIE was right on her tail, dodging and weaving through the innards of the ship. Then Rey saw it, a blocked passageway at the end. The TIE locked on them. She could feel it. Flying on nothing but nerve, she jerked the yoke to the right, sending the Falcon through a gap in the wreck's hull and soaring out into the blue sky again. Then she pushed the Falcon down. They had to lose height fast. She had to line up the shot perfectly for Finn. They were flipping in the sky, and the TIE was on them, and then Finn fired right as the ship's gun turret rotated toward the TIE. He made the shot, and the TIE exploded just as Rey strained for the stabilizer, reached it, and deployed it. The Falcon righted itself, smoothed out, and that was it. They'd won. With her heart leaping in her chest, Rey aimed them out of Jakku's atmosphere and into space. I'm leaving Jakku, her mind was screaming. Leaving. She and Finn had one moment of joy, shouting at each other with all the excitement of having defeated the First Order fighters in a creaky piece of space junk, when the motivator blew, filling the propulsion tank and giving them only minutes before the tank overflowed, contaminating the air supply. She had just applied the patch when the whole ship went dark. They were being sucked into what they thought was a First Order ship. The Falcon was disabled. The bigger ship was overriding all of their controls. No amount of flying would get them out of this predicament. Scrambling to think of a solution, sure that stormtroopers would be on them at any moment, they hid in a cargo hatch. When the door slid open, and instead of stormtroopers, Han and Chewie appeared. Han was about to agree to help them get BB-8 to the Resistance base when they heard a dull thudding somewhere in the depths of the ship. Han took off running. Rey and Finn followed. Han was hauling Rathtars, it turned out, huge, slimy, tentacly creatures with circular mouths and thousands of teeth. Before Rey could fully absorb what was happening, members of the Guavian Death Gang boarded the ship, followed in short order by the gang known as Concha Club. Han stuffed Rey and Finn into a compartment with orders not to move until he'd gotten rid of the intruders. But from what Rey and Finn overheard from their hiding place, Han was trapped between the two gangs. They both wanted money from him, and there didn't seem to be a good way out. Rey and Finn crawled through the bowels of the freighter until Rey found a fuse panel, and a light clicked on in her head. If she could just reset the fuses, they could close the corridor doors remotely, and both gangs would be trapped. It was a brilliant plan, except that she reset the wrong fuses. The doors she opened were the doors of the Rathtars' holding cells. Rathtars rolled into the corridors, tentacles waving, giant mouths gaping. The gangs, thrown into confusion, fired and scattered. Rey and Finn managed to find a hatch back into the main corridor of the freighter, only to come face to teeth with a Rathtar. Rey just had time to see the giant waving ball roaring at them hungrily before she and Finn took off in the opposite direction. Heart pounding in her ears, adrenaline pumping through her veins, Rey ran as hard as she had ever run. Suddenly, Finn screamed. Rathtar had snared him, its tentacle like a chain around his waist. It was dragging him backward along the metal floor. She screamed for him, but the Rathtar had him in his tentacles, holding him high in the air. It rolled backward with surprising speed, dragging him around a corner and down a distant corridor, leaving Rey with nothing but the sound of his panicked screams. Rey ran through the ship, yelling for Finn, frantic to do something, anything. She rushed up to the bank of monitors only to see images of Finn being dragged down a corridor. Do something! She could see the Rathtar yanking Finn through a doorway. He screamed again. Rey stared at the screen. She felt her mind grow calm. She focused on the screen and pressed the button to activate the door, slamming it shut with the Rathtar on one side and Finn on the other. Finn hit the floor as the door severed the Rathtar's tentacles, which flopped and slithered next to him. Rey ran down the corridor, relief flooding her. Finn was okay, but they still had to escape the ship. Panting and covered in Rathtar slime, they ran together through the freighter and out into the main hangar, where Han and Chewie were standing at the base of the Falcon. Chewie was hurt. Han shouted directions at them as they scrambled onto the ship. Rey slid into the co-pilot seat, and she and Han powered up the Falcon as Chewie howled in pain in the medbay. Suddenly, a huge mouth and tentacles was plastered to the windshield, and Rey shrieked. One of the Rathtars had found them and attached itself to the front of the ship. Meanwhile, the surviving gang members started firing from the ground. Han applied the thrust, and the ship stalled halfway through its lift. Compressor, Rey ventured and pointed at the control panel. Han shot her a glance, and she hit the switch. The ship rose, engines firing. Han jumped to light speed, and they braced themselves as the Falcon launched forward, pulverizing the Rathtar and blasting through the wall of the freighter, then shooting them out into the vast darkness of space beyond. Now, everyone was safe, and they were on their way to Takodana to see Han's friend Maz Kanata, in hopes that she could help them get to the resistance. The information in BB-8, what he was carrying, was about Luke Skywalker. It was too important to let fall into the wrong hands. Rey stretched her arms over her head and exhaled. All in all, things have gone pretty well, don't you think? Her words were cut off as the Falcon gave a sudden massive jolt.
What the?
Han thumbed the controls.
We dropped out of hyperspace, he said. What's going on?
Rey's stomach plunged. Did you do a full sweep for tracking devices? She asked Han.
This doesn't sound good, Finn yelled somewhere behind them. Chewie! Han called over his shoulder. You scanned it, right?
Chewie roared in assent. Han looked over at Rey.
So we should be okay. Probably just a malfunction of some kind.
Rey shook her head. Uncas's been using a kind of modified tracking device. We might need to do a visual check. Thoughts were whirling through her mind.
I'll get the hyperdrive back online, Han said. You go check the rest of the ship with Chewie. He twisted around and eyed BB-8. You, Ball, scan the ship again.
The droid beeped in response as Rey ran down the corridor to Chewbacca and Finn. What's going on? Finn asked. Unca hired me to help him fix ships, Rey told him. I never put a tracker on the Falcon, but he may have. She stopped and glanced at Chewie. The problem is, she continued, I don't know exactly where Unca would have planted it. It could be anywhere. Rey pulled open an access panel and scanned the masses of wires inside. Nothing. She slammed the door shut. They had to hurry. Finn trailed behind them, looking around even though he obviously had no idea what he was looking for. Sweat rolled down Rey's face, pooling at the base of her neck. Chewie roared a suggestion, and her head jerked up. Chewie, that's it! She resisted the urge to hug the Wookiee. That's brilliant! You are good. Come on! She walked as fast as she could toward the back of the ship, Chewie by her side. Hey, did you guys figure out where it is? Finn asked, struggling to keep up with them. Chewie roared. What did he say? Finn looked confusedly at Rey. Rey grabbed Finn by the arm. He thinks we should look near the active sensor pulse generator. Unca could have hid it there undetected. She took a breath. Since the augmenter would boost the modulation. She stopped and looked at Finn. He raised his eyebrows. Sorry I asked, he said. Rey grinned. Ships are my kind of thing. Finn nodded slowly. Yeah, I got that. The active sensor pulse generator flashed red at the back of the ship. They skidded to a stop in front of it. Chewie opened the panel. Cradled in a nest of wires, a small circular black object flashed red. Rey slapped Chewie's shoulder. There it is! She cried. Hang on, I got this, Finn said, pushing her aside. No, wait! Rey shouted, realizing what Finn was about to do. Chewie barked a warning as well. It was too late. Finn pulled out the tracker. Looking proud of himself, but immediately the ship gave a tremendous shake, throwing them all off balance. What did I do? Finn yelled, holding the device up in one hand. It's rigged! Rey shouted over the shaking of the ship. She grabbed a panel handle behind her to brace her feet. Chewie roared and pointed. The device was beeping. Finn stood frozen. Chewie grabbed the tracker from Finn as the ship gave another massive shake, the floor dropping beneath their feet. Chewie, get the tracker to the airlock! It's going to explode! Rey yelled. Chewie roared. Rey fell against Finn, who was still standing with his mouth open. Go on, Han! She shouted at him. He stared at her for an instant, eyes wide, and then ran. In the cockpit, Han hunched intently over the control panel. Hyperdrive's back on, he announced. Punching a button, BB-8 chirped. The cockpit door banged open so hard it ricocheted back into Finn's face. Solo, we found a bomb, he yelled at Han. A bomb? Yes. Just get ready to punch it, Finn said. Back in the hold, Rey and Chewie stumbled over to the airlock. Chewie roared, holding the device. Now, Rey said. Chewie threw the airlock handle and tossed the tracker in. Through the window, Ray saw a blossom of fire explode in the blackness of space, as if in slow motion. The explosion shook the ship. The ship stopped shaking, and beautiful silence descended. A short while later, they all lay sprawled in the ship's main hold. Ray couldn't stop smiling, and Chewie couldn't either. Han looked from one to the other, one eyebrow raised. "Great catch, kid," he said to Ray. Finn nudged her in the ribs. Ray tried to look serious, but she couldn't keep the silly grin off her face. "Thanks," she said. "We make a pretty good team." And then she followed Han into the cockpit, and they were back on their way to Takodana. The